So we'll get started. Come and join us up front. You're welcome to join us at the table up here, as the panelists are going to move up here in about a minute. How many of you had the opportunity to listen to the discussion this morning, the first of the sessions that we've had on AI for Good? Great. So if you haven't had a chance to either join us for the plenary or watch the recording of the Introduction to AI and AI for Good that we did on October 25th, I encourage you to do that. The link to that recording is posted in the agenda, and then obviously the link to the recording from the summit is on YouTube. What we wanted to do in this session is just realizing that there are a lot of questions around ethics and bias in AI as it relates to incorporating AI technologies in our work, is really dedicate a whole session to a discussion around that topic. And while we have a group of stellar panelists with us today that will join us up here, we also have the panelists from the earlier discussion available for any questions, and really we hope to make this interactive. We will tackle a few questions, but at the same time, there will be questions that we're not going to have answers to, and we'll continue to explore them beyond this session. And similarly to what I said earlier this morning, what we're really trying to do with this initial proactive engagement around AI for Good is to identify what topics you're most interested in learning about. What are the things that you'd like to share with the community in terms of what you're learning from your implementations? And then who else do we need to have in a conversation, and what other resources do we need to bring to this group in order to incorporate AI in our work, or even to decide if that's the right thing to do. I'll say a few words to frame our discussion this afternoon, but really spend most of the time on the Q&A with the panelists. We have a few questions that we've decided we needed to start with to frame the discussion, to give everybody enough kind of understanding of what are some of the topics that are being discussed out there, but we do want to also leave some time for the Q&A. And I know I promised that yesterday for the identity session, we barely got to like 3 questions. So I'll try to keep us on track this time. So the central promise of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is about leaving no one behind. So if AI is to advance the work that we're all doing to achieve Sustainable Development Goals that all of you are familiar with, it will have to benefit all with no exception. That means that human-centered, social, and inclusive AI is not an option, it's actually a must. That's kind of one thought that we want to tee up for this discussion. The second is around really to create AI-powered solutions that are inclusive and ethical. We need to keep in mind that we have existing inequalities and biases. Just to name a few, there are 3.9 billion people today that are not connected to the internet. If you think about some of the discussion this morning around data, and data being the starting point for AI, it's really difficult and expensive to get the data about some of the people that we care about the most because they're not online. There are also gaps that are based on race, on gender, on sexual, political, and cultural orientations, and also economic inequalities, or even access to technology for people with disabilities. So whether we want it or not, we actually live in a world that is prejudiced, biased, and not equal. So how do we now make sure that the implementation of technologies that promise so many wonderful things does not exacerbate existing inequalities and biases across our systems? So during this panel, what we want to discuss is really 3 key questions that we thought would be useful for the first introduction to this topic. One is around really understanding of some of the risks and issues associated with AI and its application across the work that NetHope members and NetHope community are focused on, which includes humanitarian context, development context, and conservancy. This morning we shared a few examples of how AI is being applied in our sector. It's really early days. Let's also look at some of the risks and issues. The second thing we'll talk about is what can we do, and specifically both humanitarian sector, but also our technology partners in this room and the research institutions that we're working with to prevent, to minimize, and to mitigate those issues. And then on a more optimistic note, how can AI be used to support inclusion and human rights? And what are some of the necessary conditions for that? So I'm really honored to have a wonderful group of panelists, experts with us. I will invite them to join me right now. First, Anna Beccarelli, who leads on AI research and policy for Amnesty International globally, largely documenting and exploring the human rights risks and harms, focusing on discrimination and privacy infringements. Kentaro Toyama, who's a faculty member at the University of Michigan doing research on digital technologies interaction with international development. He has a PhD in computer vision, or AI, and AI research, has done AI research that has contributed to Microsoft Kinect system. And Nora Lindstrom, representing also NetHope membership in this discussion, is a global lead for digital development at Plan International, and she's focusing on exploring the opportunities and threats technology raises for gender inequality specifically. So thank you so much for joining us. So to get started, coming back to the first question, let's explore a few examples of what can go wrong. Let's start with you, Anna.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Leila. Can you all hear me? Okay. Okay, great. So, as Leila said, I'm from Amnesty International, and we've been looking for the past few years at the human rights implications of AI. We're not anti-AI or machine learning, but we do know that this kind of technology raises quite a lot of human rights risks, including privacy infringement risk, because it's just part of a big data system, and then also risks related to access to particular rights, particularly in the economic, social, cultural fields, so maybe access to education, healthcare, and so on, when in action. But saying that, for Amnesty, our primary focus at the minute is on the discriminatory risks of AI. And we know that this technology is not only compounding existing discrimination based on whether that's data sets or existing structural discrimination in society, but then also creating new discriminations. And that could be twofold, so it can be intentional. We know, for example, that this technology can be used to target and persecute particular people. In China, an example of this is in Xinjiang province, the state authorities are using many advanced AI technologies like gait recognition, facial recognition technologies to monitor and then persecute the Muslim Uyghur population, for example. And there are also inadvertent risks. So they're in the criminal justice system, for example. In the US, we know that predictive policing has augmented racial bias in the system. There's some great examples from HR DAG, also recidivism scoring. I would check out the machine bias study from ProPublica, which is an often cited example, but for a reason, in that it showed basically black people to be much higher risk of having computers discriminate against them. In the UK, Amnesty has been researching the London Gangs Matrix, which is an automated system used by the Metropolitan Police Service to automate risk scoring of individuals that they may believe to be involved with gang crime, and basically, again, massively discriminates against young black men and boys. So to summarize, sorry, discriminatory risks are manifold.
Thank you for sharing a few examples. Kentaro, what are some of the examples that you want to bring into the discussion?
I think Anna's examples are great. I think those are are in fact some of the greater concerns. One thing I will add to that is to say that these are not things that happen in exotic situations that most of us are not aware of. Like online search today is already deeply biased simply because of the degree to which it reflects what's out there, and what's out there is deeply biased. Probably many of you have heard about this issue with what happens when you do an image search for 3 black teenagers versus 3 white teenagers. You can still do this on your phone right now and see the results. Some of those things are frightening in the sense that we now are encouraging our kids, 5th graders, to go out and use Google to do research for their assignments, and they're basically getting back results that are inherently biased. And so I think that's one issue. And then the other thing I would say about AI is I don't really distinguish. There's no point at which computing technology becomes AI, and after that it's AI, and before that it's not AI. There are some things that are clearly not quite AI, and there are some things where we could say, okay, that's really intelligent, but it's a smooth transition. And even before the bias, there's all kinds of ways in which technology can just be screwed up. So, for example, in Michigan, where I'm from, recently there was this problem with a system that was automatically deciding who should be on the rolls for food aid. And one of the things that the system did was it would take off people who were former felons because of a Michigan law. And that law itself is debatable, but basically the computer system made very bad matches based on what were probably similar names of people who lived in similar towns, and took off 20,000 people who did nothing wrong and were by rights deserving of food aid, but didn't get the food stamps because of computer error. And that wasn't corrected for multiple years. Another example that is almost funny, except for this poor family that got involved, is there's this, apparently there's a family in the middle of Kansas somewhere that even now routinely gets random law enforcement people coming to their door and asking them about a range of crimes that they have, of course, never heard of. And it turns out that some company located, I think, in New England, who is a mapping company, and what they do is they match various things to the likely geographic location based on IP addresses. And sometimes they don't know where something is except that it's in the continental United States. So they assign it to the geographic center of the United States and happens to be this person's house. And so this system is out there, the data is out there, the company now knows that it's a mistake and has corrected a problem, but the data is out there, and so this poor family still gets occasional calls from law enforcement saying, tell us what you know about such and such a problem. So, yeah, there's all kinds of bad things that can happen, both technical and then I think, along the lines of bias, which are really human issues.
Yeah, all helpful examples. So Nora, you look at technologies from the perspective of gender bias. What are some of the examples that you're aware of?
So a really concrete example and an issue maybe there's someone in the room here today might help me address is Google Translate. Google supports 100 languages. It's got 500 million users, I've read, every day. But if you type from and many of you may have heard this example, but if you type in from a language like Finnish or Turkish that uses gender-neutral pronouns, if you type in something about a president, then when it translates into English, it becomes a he. He's a president. If you type in something about a nurse, then it's a she. So this is a way where Google Translate is actually entrenching gender stereotypes and reinforcing them. And as Kintara was saying, our kids are going online, we are going online, we're getting that repeated to us all the time. I honestly don't see any reason for why it can't be he, she, or they even, if you want to go beyond binary gender.
And that's based on the data.
And that's based on the data. So this idea that it's sort of reflecting the current, but in our sector, we're aspirational. We want gender equality. So how do we harness, AI to actually help us move that forward? And really, we don't know when someone is typing in a language that uses gender-neutral pronouns if they mean he or she. We don't know that, so why can't Google Translate reflect that? One thing that we've done at Plan is we've developed this app, it's a keyboard app that uses predictive text. Now, it's not AI-based, but a lot of predictive text is moving in that direction, and I totally agree with Kantara as well, it's a smooth line. So if you type in on your phone, and you can try this, if you type in girls can be, If I do that on my phone, then the next words it will give me is revisited, used, and devastating. Not great. I won't tell you what kind of phone I have. So we've developed this app that actually suggests more empowering words when you type in something about girls or women. So if you type in, it's called Sheboard, you can access it on Google Play. This is no plug for it, sorry. But if you type in girls can be, then it'll give you things like serious, athletic, or loud. So less gender stereotypical words. So this is aimed at really empowering girls and also making us think about how we talk about girls and boys and how, you know, digital is actually reinforcing in many cases gender stereotypes.
Yeah, excellent examples. So now that you all are probably aware of many other examples. These are just some of the examples that we wanted to bring into discussion, and then switch to talking about what are some of the existing frameworks that can actually help us guide the development of AI and also implementation of AI. Anna, let's start with you. As you mentioned, you've done a lot of the policy work.
Yeah, so at Amnesty, I led the creation of the Toronto Declaration, which is a policy paper that we worked on with the digital rights group Access Now, and we launched back in May at RightsCon. And it's basically a paper outlining how the human rights framework applies to this technology. We looked particularly at the right to equality and non-discrimination in machine learning systems, and basically applied the existing human rights framework to this new technology. Because we're seeing a kind of trend of like ethical AI, and we really want to communicate that you don't need to reinvent the wheel on this, that there is existing legislation and protections for people around their right to equality and basic freedoms. So we worked with the tech industry on this. We had people in the room from all the big tech companies. We worked with many civil society organisations to come up with a bit of a kind of perspective, hope for what we can do with the human rights framework with regards to this technology. So do search for the Toronto Declaration, and we've kind of laid out there what we believe some mechanisms could be for example, the right to redress and remedy, which is a key, you know, human rights concept that we really need to think about in this space with regards to user rights and how someone who is harmed by this technology goes about, you know, claiming justice. You know, with these systems which are often invisible, you know, how does someone know when they're harmed by a system, and then how can they challenge it? We've got some really, really big questions ahead of us to ask as an industry. And so on the human rights framework side, there's also the business and human rights due diligence process. So that's, you know, a sort of three-step process looking at how a business can assess the risks of its technology, take steps, secondly, to remedy those risks, and then kind of over time look at mitigating ongoing risks and providing access to redress. So yeah.
Kintara, what would you add to this?
I mean, I think Anna is completely right that there are lots of kind of ethical frameworks by which we should be thinking, and that they, you know, precede whatever we might say about AI. I think in the context of international development, you know, I kind of recommend being a late adopter approach to technology adoption. I mean, there is so much stuff, you know, that we could be doing right now that we know to be impactful, and for which you know, the evidence is there that it's going to be impactful, that, you know, we shouldn't be in a rush to try new things just because they're new and shiny. And in the case of things like AI, I think the risk is considerable. And so I personally think for the most part, there's certainly exceptions, but for the most part, it's perfectly okay as a nonprofit organization trying to address international development to be, you know, let's do the stuff that we know works, and worry about, you know, you incorporate the technology once everybody else has had to go and figured out all the kinks.
Nora, what are your thoughts on this, just this idea of late adopter, but then also what we do today that was discussed on a panel this morning? What do you think the nonprofit or humanitarian sector should do today?
I'm on the slightly on the late adopter side, but at the same time, I think it's really important, as came out in the panel this morning, that we really engage in these conversations, and we're also testing it out. Because who else is going to look at AI to harness AI for equality? Who else is going to do that work if we're not engaged in those discussions? So I think it's really important that we are there. And I've said to many people ahead of this panel that, you know, my comfort zone is here and I'm here right now. But I think it's so important that we are here, that we're engaging in these conversations, that we're bringing our expertise and being critical, because we know that other people aren't going to ask these questions, and we need to think about how to harness the power of AI for equality. And that's why I think we need to be here.
Yeah, so it's like balancing the trade-offs between the risk and the issue you might create, and then also just the benefits, whether it's solving the problem and also influencing in a way that it gets developed in a way that benefits all. Let's actually talk about what specifically, we talked about frameworks, but what specifically can we do to prevent, to minimize, or to mitigate some of the risks or some of the examples that you've shared? And if we were to leave this group between 3 of you with a checklist of 5 things that could be done, what would it be? Qatar?
Yeah, so I think of this as an analogy with like medical care at home. Okay, so there's some things where everybody should be doing it and it's perfectly okay, like applying a Band-Aid when your kid gets a cut. Great, okay. Home surgery, probably not so much. And it's not a question of whether you're going to do it right or not. You know, unless you're a doctor, there's a good chance something's going to go wrong, regardless of how many YouTube videos are out there to show you how to do it. And how many workshops you go to show you how to do it. And so, my feeling about these things is, I mentioned earlier, I think there are exceptions to, who should be experimenting with these things, but I think those exceptions are entities that can afford and have, if not in-house, at least, very dedicated, committed advising with respect to both the technology and also how the technology might impact the use to which it's being put. I think it's as irresponsible to apply extremely powerful technologies while being, kind of this amateur status, as it is to be a non-trained person and start performing surgery on your family members.
So it's an oversight and audit process.
Yeah, I would say it's oversight and audit. I mean, there are, we have analogies to these things. Like, for example, we think of that financial oversight is sufficiently important that, legally organizations are required to have, first of all, good accounting practices, and then second of all, an audit process. I think with more and more powerful technologies, that's also required.
Yeah. Nora, what would you add to this?
The one thing I love to talk about is diversity in tech and diverse teams. So I really think that something that we need to make sure is that we have diverse teams involved in creating, in overseeing, in engaging with AI.
All aspects of diversity.
All aspects of diversity, from gender to all other aspects as well.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that as a sector, as an international development sector, we actually have an important role in nurturing that diversity in the global south. We're engaged in making sure that there are enough doctors, that there are enough teachers. I think we should also be engaged in looking at making sure that there's enough technologists and people engaged in AI in the countries that we work in, so that they can engage in these conversations and be at the tables where we're looking at ethical AI, where we're looking at applications of AI, so that we're not engaging in a form of sort of digital colonialism, where we're sort of looking at it in the global north and then we're going to apply it in the global south. So I think we need to look at having diverse teams of all sorts involved at all levels in the AI process.
One of the other things that you mentioned before we get to Anna was around better data. Can you talk a little about that why that should be part of the checklist?
Yes, I thought, as you mentioned when you sort of gave the introduction, half the world is offline, so we don't really have a digital footprint of a lot of people. So better data to me means making sure that we actually have data on the people that we're trying to target. And we don't necessarily have that. Even if we're looking at getting data from a particular area, say, then who in that area is creating that digital footprint? We know there's a massive digital gender divide. We know that in certain areas, men and boys are significantly more likely to have smartphones than women and girls. So this impacts on the digital footprint. So who do we actually have data on? And then the other thing is just remembering that AI is making predictions on the basis of historical data for the future. So again, it's going to be replicating the inequalities that exist in that and the biases that exist in that data. And we need to be really, really, really critical of that data.
Yeah, so one point on data, because it's been an ask from this group to spend some more more time on data for AI, because it's such a problem and so core to AI. So those of you who will be in the workshop tomorrow, Kristen, who's in the back of the room, will spend quite a bit of time, actually majority of the session, talking about what is good data and how do we get to that point. And in fact, we're actually looking to turn that into a course so it could be available to all of you. But really, and also thinking about what's the role of the humanitarian sector and all the different stakeholders, not just the data scientists, but all the different stakeholders in the process. So Anna, what do you think we need to do in order to mitigate and prevent those risks?
I think my main kind of mission in this field is to really raise the visibility of these systems, and that has so many strands. Partly it's talking to other civil society organisations and saying that this is a real issue, you need to get on board now, like you're saying, and kind of influence and really talk to the creators of the tech as well. So raising visibility of the systems will allow us to interrogate it as well. So at the minute, all we know around the kind of discriminatory application or inadvertent bias is through investigative journalism, it's through NGOs kind of chipping away. There's no need for any company or state to kind of reveal that it's using algorithmic technology. And so that's the kind of first step, would allow, visibility of these systems would allow us to really interrogate where they're being used, how they're being used, and just that kind of base layer for us to be able to hold them accountable. And also for people to be able to challenge decisions that are made by themselves, like you say in healthcare. They're just being used in every aspect of life, and we really need to upskill ourselves in the sector, but then also, users need to be aware of decisions that are being made about themselves, which leads me to my next point, is around remedy and meaningful remedy and access to redress for those who are harmed by the system. So the responsibility there really falls on the state and also companies to be able to provide mechanisms that allow people to challenge a decision that is made about themselves, and then also be able to get meaningful access to remedy. And I think that we've got a very long way to go in that respect. We have not nailed that at all, so we're starting from scratch there.
Yeah, and this is actually a super important point given how we implement programs in the field, this notion of having a process to actually go back and fix those issues, especially when you don't have that technology expertise. You have the subject matter expertise, but not technology expertise in-house. We need to be thinking about how do you go back a year later, 3 years later, if data or context has changed, or as something has gone wrong, to fix those issues. Let's now switch to talking about how do we ensure that the technologies that are getting created are not implementing or scaling bias and causing other ethical issues. So I think Nora and Tara, you had a couple of things you wanted to say on that topic.
Well, at the moment we're developing a chatbot called Tessa together with Accenture, and it's really working on getting supporting young people on their path to employment. So it's you can access it through Facebook Messenger, and it'll sort of guide you and help you create a CV and so on. It's been piloted in the Philippines, and so in developing that, we are constantly auditing it for gender bias. We're constantly being highly aware of, how could this reinforce gender bias at every single level. And we're also, at the moment, we're looking at should it start entrenching sort of, for example, should it start sort of guiding girls who are using it to hairdressing careers, or something like that. How can we develop flags into the system so that if we see it acting in that way, then it would flag it up and we can go and try to address that. It's still being developed, but my point here is that I think we need to have this kind of gender and inclusion audits all along the way.
Tara?
Yeah, I think it's useful to think of this in two separate categories. One is what happens within the organization that you're at, and the other is what happens in the larger world. And I think, on this panel we have both concerns. I would say that, even if everybody in this room did everything right with AI, we would still have huge bias problems out there because of the fact that, most of the people in this room are not in control of the technology that is unleashed on most of the world, right? And so, with respect to that larger issue, I think there's anytime there's a power differential of that magnitude, there is no other solution than collective action. And so I would say a little bit more about this afternoon, but I think that, exactly groups like this, it's not enough for us to do the right thing on our own. We have to group together and really lobby the organizations that we think are doing something wrong, and get these, audit processes and, encourage them to have processes whereby they're more accountable to the public, and it's not just a question of, just following the letter of the law.
One thing that I'm not hearing in this discussion, we talked about process and frameworks. What about standards?
I mean, I think one of the challenges with standards is it's still a little bit early to figure out what those might be. And then, this technology is changing every day. And so by the time you have a standard, the next day there's a new problem. And so I think the challenge with standards is that it will give you the illusion that you've done something, right? And I'm sure companies are like, oh, we're following this ISO standard of ethics, blah, blah, blah. But the next day there'll be another breach of what is under, at heart a rights issue or an ethics issue. And so I think far more than the standard, it's important to have this mechanism by which feedback is actually taken into account.
That's great, thank you. So let's actually talk about the more kind of optimistic and positive side. What can actually go well in terms of how can we use AI to support inclusion in human rights? Again, we've talked about the examples of where AI can help us solve different problems that we're focusing on, but what about this problem around inclusion, equality, and human rights? Anna?
Yeah, so at Amnesty we are using AI and machine learning technologies to help us document and analyse human rights abuses. So from our perspective, it has the same appeal for us that the technology has in the outside world, and that it helps us efficiently to process vast amounts of data and analyse that data. So I'll run through three examples very quickly. The first is satellite imagery and mapping. So we've used this in Sudan, Darfur, to map where villages have been decimated by an authority, and we've crowdsourced the training of this algorithm by volunteers who have used Google imagery and satellite imagery to sort of do a compare and contrast to train an algorithm, and then we can apply that algorithm to other satellite data. Secondly, with regards to reporting on executions worldwide, we used to have a very cumbersome process whereby we asked volunteers in various countries around the world to document this, and kind of through media reports as well as legal volunteers. And we've now set up an automated process where we can sort of crowdsource that information from media reporting as well as legal documentation. So it's quite a kind of rudimentary process. And then thirdly, we have a particular project called Toxic Twitter around analysing hate speech online. We've looked at abuse and harassment of women on social media platforms, and we did a sentiment analysis of tweets targeted at female politicians in the UK during a particular period to train an algorithm to, again, look at kind of sentiment analysis and through natural language processing. So definitely AI can help us in our field. I think we still need these checks and balances, obviously, and we want to use it carefully, but pilot projects are really kind of helping us test where we can go in the future with this.
Tara?
I'm actually not very good at coming up with positive examples. But yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, there's all kinds of situations where if you do have routine need to process data and it's very labor intensive, there's a good chance some of it can be automated, and increasingly that'll be true. Like, from 5 years from now, even more of that will be automatable. The one thing I will say with all of these positive examples is that it's really important to look at who's doing it. And if you dig deeper, there will always be an Amnesty International doing it, or there will be a Plan International doing it, which is to say that an organization with the right intentions is underneath it, and therefore the impact of the technology is positive. If you then assume, oh yeah, the technology is positive, so now I'm going to take it to this other organization where those same intentions might not be there, the same technology can do bad things.
Yeah, so you're highlighting one of the necessary conditions
Right.
in this case. Okay, great. Nora?
I think of it sort of like AI doesn't have a bad day. I have a bad day sometimes. I have biases. And AI, it is consistent, So if we apply it in limited ways, in places where you can automate things, then we can have it as an aid for our decision making. Because if I sit in a recruitment panel, if I have a bad day, then I may not receive whoever is applying for the job in the same way as I received another person yesterday, And we know that AI recruitment, many of you have probably heard of Amazon's problems with this. It didn't work. So I'm not saying that that's perfect by any means, but this idea that AI is consistent, it doesn't have a bad day, and we are also biased. So there are opportunities there.
Yeah, it could help us do a bit better. So with this, hopefully this has provided some baseline of understanding of examples of where things can really go wrong, what we could do, and then also how do we use AI to address problems that we are all working on, which is around equality and inclusion. What are some of the questions that you have, or even examples that you want to offer, and anything you'd like to add to the checklist that we sort of quickly assembled right here? Go ahead.
Hi.
Please say your name and your organization.
Yes, my name is Ricardo Mancuso. I work at Plan International, so I'm a colleague of Nora's for full disclosure. Following the Brexit, potential Brexit that might happen.
Still potential.
Yeah, absolutely. Nothing is complete until everything is complete. There's been a lot of talk in the UK about a digital Bill of Rights, and it's the Liberal parties that want this. It's the left of centre parties that want it. The right wing, not so much. They want it, but they want to keep it secret under GCHQ. How do you think a digital Bill of Rights can impact what we're talking about here, the use of ethical AI to protect people and their digital footprint once that digital footprint is available? I guess that's a question for whomever. I was thinking out more, but
I mean, I think that what we've seen here is that the law is so far behind the technology. I think that I'm generally in favour of a digital Bill of Rights if it enshrines human rights protections. Always yes for that. But I think the problem here is that just states are so far behind, and only in the last kind of couple of years we've seen them consulting on the uses of AI technology, which is great that they're doing that, but the build is so far ahead. Silicon Valley is just so detached from this world. So I think the challenge is really kind of getting in touch with the tech industry, bringing in some regulation there. I think a Bill of Rights is a great idea, but my hesitation is kind of echoing Carol's earlier point around the tech moves so fast. Can we ever really keep our finger on the pulse?
And I think a lot of it depends on what's actually in it. So I'm personally a little bit wary of rights that are about ensuring more actual things that you have to invest resources in for more people, because I think that turns what is really a trade-off question into a black and white question, and so it's a little bit difficult. But I'm very jealous of the European, GDPR and rights around privacy, which really cost nobody anything except the companies who are who ultimately profit from it. In the United States, we need to have that kind of rights thinking, I think it depends a lot on what's actually in it.
Other questions?
My name's Sam. I use they, them pronouns from Tech Impact. I'm curious, you talked about sort of accountability from the people who are impacted, and you talked about this audit methodology. I'm curious if you have thoughts on what data should be published about an AI algorithm in order to create some sense of accountability, Is that even possible, or do we really just have to trust the people building the algorithms, that they have people's best interests in mind and are doing the audits? But is it possible to have a scorecard or some kind of thing that you can put out into the world when you implement AI?
And I also want to make sure that the panelists from the earlier session feel free to raise their hands if they want to participate in this discussion and contribute.
Sure. I'll say that is still nascent thinking. I have colleagues who are thinking exactly about what does it mean to do an algorithmic audit. It's pretty challenging. Does it mean somebody has to literally do a code review of everything, or is it possible that the people who write the code can publish a summary of what it's doing? It's unclear. So yeah, I think at this point it's still to be determined exactly what that might involve. But I do think that the process and ensuring that there are people who are qualified and understand what the code might involve, have an opportunity to look at the code, that kind of thing, I think is ultimately important.
Aubrey?
Can I just jump in? So I would say vehemently, no, we should not just trust the people developing the algorithm to do the right thing, even when you have the best intentions, even when it is an amnesty or a plan. I think that you really do need to think about what your blind spots are, because no matter who you are, the choices that you make when you're making value judgments about how to check your data, how to check the effectiveness of your algorithm, are going to be different from your neighbor's value judgments. And I think that's the conversation that we need to be moving toward having more openly and more frequently. I would agree with you, Kantar. I think it's a very difficult thing to have just like one objective framework that everyone can have an auditing process in place. But I know that there are efforts. So there's, is it Orca? Kathy O'Neill has put together a nascent company whose sole purpose is to do this kind of auditing of algorithms, and they claim it's like the organic sticker for algorithms, so that if you have this stamp on your algorithm, you're good, which I'm very skeptical about. But I think that that's the kind of thing that it's worth exploring and seeing how something comparable could be developed.
Thank you, Aubrey. Anyone else wants to contribute or questions? I think there was a question in the back. Lady with, yes.
Hi, my name is Caitlin. I'm the M&E director with Mercy Corps Congo, and my question is for Nora. Nora, you mentioned digital colonialism, and I'm curious about how you see the role of, or how you see digital colonialism in the NGO sphere right now. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? And what should NGOs be doing about it, whether in AI or in the tech sphere more generally?
In terms of trends, I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that. But in terms of what we should be doing, I definitely think that we need to look inwards and outwards. I think we need to look inwards in terms of our own IT teams, our own digital teams. Do we have diversity internally? But I also think that we need to do actual programming on building digital skills, on exposing the people that we work with and to digital, to tech, to making them digitally literate. We have innovation hubs for out-of-school youth in Uganda and Ethiopia, where they can come in and try out new tech, including AI, to expose them, to really nurture that sort of local talent. So as I was saying before, I think we need to think about the tech sector as something that we're training people into, just as we're involved in getting teachers, getting doctors, etc. So this is something that we need to develop at the local level. And I think as a sector, we're increasingly recognizing the need for diversity in tech. There's a lot of talk about girls in tech and so on. But it can't just be external. We need to look at it internally as well. Who are the people that in our organizations are pushing this forward? I spoke to our colleagues running the innovation hubs, and one of the things that they were saying is that they're all about getting more girls into learning about new technologies and engaging in the sector. But most of the trainers that they get are male. So in terms of having the female role models, etc. Now I know this is a wider sort of tech, it's not just AI, but I think it comes to bear on AI as well, because it's a crucial part that we need to work on.
It's a real issue, and there is an organization in the U.S. called AI for All that is focusing on training up more diverse populations to be part of development, not just application and usage of AI. And we're actually looking to bring them into the conversation and share some of their training through our NetHope resources. I'll take one more question, and then panelists will be available for a discussion afterwards because there's another session right after. So you've been waiting to ask a question.
So Ludovic Sophia from MSF. The question is more related to the basic principles and standards. And do we have any idea of, like in medical domain, there are lines like not to pass, right? Everybody agreed on after years, right? And do we have any idea of the non-profit or our organizations, what we would recommend to have, like very basic principles that we would fight for?
And specifically for digital things?
Yeah,
or just
so like for AI, like not to be used for manipulation, not to be used for, you know. One reason why I use the medical field as an analogy is because they're so far ahead on this kind of thinking, right? I mean, they've had at least 100+ years of a science of medicine and then this ethical framework on top. I'll say as a computer scientist that computer science is nowhere near there. I mean, we were just now beginning to have a public discussion about the potential dark side of technology. There are engineering organizations that have various ethical codes of conduct, but they're not taken as seriously as doctors take their medical code seriously. But I think there's a very similar analogy. Like first do no harm is a great one to start with, and then there's things you were mentioning like should it be used for manipulation, even if it's positive manipulation. That gets very tricky very fast.
Anyone else wants to contribute to this question from the panel?
I know Google just released the AI.
Yeah, sure. We announced.
Can you just repeat after Jen?
Yeah, we announced earlier this year as a whole our AI principles, which are meant for ourselves and are publicly out there so that everyone holds us accountable to those principles. Included in that, there are 7 principles and there are 4 red lines, 4 lines that we won't cross, which folks can read after, but include things like not working on weapons, and there's one around obviously upholding kind of principles of human rights. They're meant to be very broad, and we've sort of been talking about them as a bit of a constitution, right? We still have to get all the case law under that constitution, and that's something that we're working on. These are not straightforward, as you guys have been discussing, these are not straightforward questions that we can just answer with a quick tick of a box. But we're working on ways that we now operationalize those internally, and I think as we learn from that process, we're also committed to trying to provide more of that out. We've also, if folks are interested, there's a set of responsible AI practices that we've published in general alongside that. They don't, they're not yet quite there either, right? This is all, like I said, still nascent, but could be potentially useful for folks who are thinking about that. What are the things that you might want to consider if you want to establish rules within your own organization, rules or principles?
I'd really champion the responsible AI practices. I think they're absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, just to try and be practical.
Yes. Yeah.
All right, I know we can continue this discussion for many hours. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to the panelists for excellent insights, and let's continue over the next 2 days.